Hey everyone, and welcome once again to our taboo busting alphabetical journey. Today is H for home. And now I know I left you on a cliffhanger last week of not really knowing how home is going to be a real taboo, but we feel like we found a couple ways to make it a taboo if it wasn't already. So maybe we're making it difficult for ourselves or really easy. We'll only find out throughout this episode. So Sylvia, welcome to your lovely home in this episode.
Thank you. It is good to be home and to talk about home with you, John Thor.
Yeah, so, when we were looking through our alphabet and actually slight behind the scenes knowledge for those watching, H didn't used to be home. And we were talking about what's next, so we don't repeat the incident in one of our first episodes where we didn't remember what the next letter was going to be. And we thought, actually, how about we dive into home? Because home is something that we've talked about a lot, both as people who live in different countries in our countries of origin, also known as immigrants. And we've also both found places of work where we've been as feeling not at home in them. We've found different groups that we've been either a part of or people have sort of assumed we're a part of as not really feeling at home. So we found it to be a nice, interesting duality to dive into for people out there who either A, live somewhere different than their country of origin, or B, people that have been pigeonholed wrong for their entire lives and might even have some anxieties tied to that.
hmm I love the framing here, John Thor. And if I may, I want to add a third in that the times I have felt at home, right, be it amongst a group of people or in a certain surrounding, I knew it right away. So this idea of home or feeling at home, I think it's so primal in all of us. And while I think we're going to talk about times when we haven't felt at home. Yet I do want to underscore that there are situations and times and places that we connect to just very naturally that bring us that sense of this is where I belong, or this is where I really can be myself. So we'll talk more about that. Yet I just wanted to add that to our discussion today.
Yeah, and I think actually, in a way, that's a really interesting place to start because then we can start from a place of feeling at home and then it sort of unravels. Because
Hmm.
from my perspective, I tie it a lot to identity. And what I mean by that is, like, I don't necessarily see Iceland, where I was born, as more of a home than wherever I live at any given point. And I think it's largely because I don't really tie my identity that much to being Icelandic. I don't take massive pride in our football team. I don't, I love the language and it is my mother tongue, but it's at the same time, I don't take offense if someone says that it's not a beautiful sounding language. It's not a massive patriotism or, national pride that comes with it. And I think for me, so much of my identity has in the past been attempted to be pigeonholed by others as, they saw me with, especially as a teenager, with like long hair and a beard, and people would, he listens to metal. And like, yeah, I listen to metal, but I listen to a lot of other stuff. But then it's like, oh, but the idea that we have about metalhead is actually this small box here and kind of need to fit in there for now. And that I've always had quite a negative reaction to that attempt to pigeonhole you. And I feel that in that discussion of home, because, I don't really feel at home in any singular place more than another. It is that feeling, it is that state of mind of, for me, for example, being around people who accept me for who I am and look at me as a three-dimensional individual rather than a cardboard cutout of a type.
Precisely.
And
I so appreciate that because, as I reflect on what really gave me a sense of home, and I like the way you talked about identity, right? Or the sort of the typecasting that some people would do to categorize people, right? Like to put them in a box of some sort for ease of processing, cognitively speaking. Yet for me, I think back to the times when I have felt at home in a situation or a physical place or an emotional place. I think it goes back to values, right? So I think back to, for example, one of the most prominent moments of me feeling a sense of belonging was when I was like 19 or 20. I was at a summer program in the mountains of Austria. So yes, very Sound of Music type setting for those who are fans of Sound of Music. Literally, that's where I was. And right here, I was in a foreign country, a foreign to me as right an Asian American, foreign to me in the way I look, right? Like very few Austrians living in that part of the world look like me. But regardless, I was with a group of people, students, college age students, who were of a global mindset, who were about learning, about being curious, in regards to languages and cultures and customs and right, even current events. So I felt that was the first time in 2 decades of my being that I really felt at home, because I found people who were like-minded, who share in my values, and who were curious about the same things as I. And that was so eye-opening. Like, again, like how is it possible? I've been asked this question: how is it possible that you would feel at home with a bunch of strangers? Like from, I think it was like 22 different countries or something. I can't remember, but it was some massive number, right, of countries represented at this international program. And I said, weirdly, yeah, aside from language and ethnic background and all that stuff, I really felt at home with these strangers because of that intellectual compatibility, or that, compatibility with values. Now, there have been places where I felt at home, right? But I think it is because of that, the shared values. Now, I joke that Hawaii is my spiritual home, as is Italy. So Hawaii and Italy are probably where I was in a former life. But people go, of course you love Italy. Of course you love Hawaii. I'm like, but I go, well, actually, there's more to it than just the surface level stuff. Like, of course, they're both beautiful places. They both, offer a lot in terms of fun, great things to do. Yet it's in kind of the values of the land, of the people, right, that I really associate with, or there's some sense of that deeper connection that I just picked up on and felt very called to. So that, for me, I think I like how you talked about identity, but for me, there's also the sense of belonging, right? Or a sense of, I think compatibility is it, but there's something more to it than that. But those are some of the, I guess, table stakes, if I could call them that.
Yeah. But I think that ties into, from my perspective, obviously, different terminology there. But for me, values are much closer to my identity than my nationality or
Yes.
language or
Yeah.
looks.
Yes.
And if I think about like top 3 or 4 places or times where in my mind I go, yeah, I felt at home, it was similar to what you said. I was in a foreign country, but I was at an art festival that I got to perform at when I was 16.
Mm.
And suddenly I was surrounded by people from different countries, but everyone united with this love to create, to be a bit outside the box. And for a week, you were just creating with new people, creating music, plays. There were people photographing, filming a documentary about the event as part of the event. And it was a lovely feeling of, being 16 and being exposed to that sort of thing, especially being from a place like Iceland, small and not very multicultural. Um, then, and I know I touched upon this in a previous discussion with you, the LGBTQ community, which is something that is really dear to me for a number of reasons, having a lot of fans that fitting into that in many ways myself, and connecting to that sense of community where there are so many multifaceted identities that they've fully accepted as part of the organization. Like it didn't used to have the Q or the I or the A or the plus or these different flags, but as soon as something new comes up and as soon as a new marginalized identity comes to fruition, sure, there are going to be people that push back, but the community at large is like, yeah, whoever you are, be who you are. You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that mindset of it, and which kind of leads me to, I guess, a third part, which is the festival that led me to moving to the UK, which was the UK Tech Metal Festival, which is this tiny little festival compared to some of the bigger ones, where basically all of the bands have one thing in common, and it's that they are incredible musicians, technically speaking, and they all happen to play music which either is heavy or inspired by heavier music. So there have been like acoustic guitar players, there have been electronic musicians, but they all sort of come under that umbrella. And being there and meeting people who to reference back to what I said previously, yeah, sure, loved a bit of metal, but also like loved jazz or technical or electronic and hip hop. And we're just there with a love of good, honest music.
Mm.
And that was just an incredible feeling to have, which again, surrounded by people from all over the world, first time being out of the country as a music journalist at the time, and just welcomed with open arms.
Mm.
And I think, yeah, to your point, sometimes it might even be easier when you step outside of what would normally be identified as your home to actually
Mm.
feel at home, because suddenly you come in there and it's not your surroundings that are identifying you or sort of putting you in a box. Suddenly you're in charge of that box. And if you don't want to have a box at all, go for it. These people have never met you. They might not know a lot about where you're from. You can sort of
Right.
reinvent yourself on the spot. And that's something that I know it really rejuvenates your sort of passion for life, doesn't it?
It really does. It harkens back to my summers at different music camps. So, for those in the U.S., I did not go to band camp, but I did go to orchestra camp. Okay, so however, the point being is when I was at the music summer camps every summer, it was like going home in that, where I was growing up, classical music, so I'm classically trained, and it wasn't the cool thing. I mean, like, what 13-year-old goes around talking about the virtues of Tchaikovsky? Like, I did, by the way. But very few of us did. Yet when I went to these summer camps, I found other people who debated with me about, right, Tchaikovsky Symphony Number 4, like, right, the merits or lack of merits, whatever you want to call it, right? And I was like, oh, this is amazing. And yet what was so sad was that, and this is the pivot part that I want to take us to. So I would go to summer camp for a month or 2 months or however long the program was, and then I would return home. So this is where it gets interesting, right? I went to summer camp. It was my spiritual home in terms of me being a classical musician, right? At the tender age of 13-ish, right? Or I mean, it really pervaded throughout my childhood years and teenage years. But at that sort of very precious teenage age, right? You're very aware of like who's part of your group, who's part of your clique, who's not. And so here I would be at summer camp finding my people, right? These are my people. And then I'll have to leave to go back to home where my belongings, like the majority of my belongings were, or where I was, properly housed by my parents at the time. But I dreaded that so much, because then I would go back to this place where I was a misfit, right? In many ways, I like really didn't find a lot of people who are 100% intellectually and emotionally compatible with me. I mean, I had some great friends, don't get me wrong. Yet home wasn't home, right? Like the physical home, the shell of a house was not home. And I would literally count down to the following year, right? The following summer when I could go back to camp. Now, good thing was I had weekend ensembles, I had, school orchestra to look forward to. Yet again, right, it was that was the escape. But that's the escape was home versus the physical home.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to me from there to dive into a number of topics, including like fandom. How many
Mm.
people find their group in a mutual love of a TV show or a
Mm.
cartoon or anything really? And for me, I've always struggled with that a bit because I like so many different things. And diving into one thing, like for example, if you were to meet someone and they were like, yeah, I love classical music, but only Tchaikovsky, and you're like, but I really like these other, and they're like,
Right.
no, 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 I know every detail about their life. I know their favorite color. I know what dietary like plans they had. Like when it's up to that level, I can't really relate.
Yeah.
But where I want to go from there is the internet, because I think the internet changed so much for our sense of home and identity,
Mm.
because suddenly you can find special interest groups about literally anything, and you can suddenly be connected with people from all over the world that share your like really specific, incredibly intricate interest in something.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen good and bad versions of this. We've seen incredibly toxic communities start, but if we just step back and look at whether it's good or bad, why people are drawn to it. And I spoke to this guy not too long ago who told me the story of how he got into video game development. And he said it started with him going through massive depression as a teenager and not really knowing where to turn to, felt bad at school, felt bad at home, and he started playing an online video game and started playing with random people. Then suddenly, though, that random group became a very solid group. And he said a lot of the people he was playing with were a lot older than him, but they treated him as an equal and figured out he wasn't feeling good, started talking to him, started encouraging him to open up. And he said suddenly he wasn't going to the game as an escape, but because it felt more like a home than anything else. And he said the idea of being able to then go into video game development to help create those spaces for people who don't feel at home anywhere else was just this incredible life's purpose that he felt once he got, to the other side, got some help and everything, and got out of that situation. Suddenly he was able to, kind of focus on, this is what I want to do. He found his purpose through finding his home. And I think that's a beautiful way to really figure out what you want to do.
I think that is so amazing. And what saddens me though is I think a lot of people don't lean into that, or they are discouraged from it, right? So I think you and I have been fortunate enough to find our own paths and our own homes, right? Spiritually, intellectually, and otherwise. Yet there's so many people who, for fear of rejection or truly, right, they just can't one way or another manage to do that. I really do feel for those people. And I mean, I can think of a number of people, from my childhood who for, I think, just comfort and security, they stay behind, versus, right, really going into that thing that would light them up and energize them and really allow them to shine in the brightest and fullest way they're meant to. So, part of me, as much as I think about how, right now as an Asian American, like there's a lot of questions like, do I belong here, right? Literally, like I'm a US citizen, like legit, do I belong here? Yeah, outside of all that, right, it is noisy, it is very difficult. I am really glad that, to your point, through various means, including the internet, I found my tribe, and you're part of that journey. Like you and I found each other on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
right? So I do want to celebrate that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, it is an interesting mix between place, circumstance, and people. Because, if we talk about the workplace for a bit, before we close this one off, I've had workplaces where I felt at home and then not anymore. And mainly the change has been, again, to your point earlier, the people and the values. It started with, a group of people motivated towards the same thing, working in a really healthy way together. And then it doesn't take more than, one person up top to go a bit sour, to be changed around, or a focus slightly altered or something, when suddenly you start seeing all these people who felt at home with each other start to be a bit at unease with how everything's going. And it's kind of like that whole saying about rats fleeing a sinking ship, except when it's a sinking company, it's the smart people that notice what's going on and jump ship. And it's interesting because that sense of home does change and evolve along with, yeah, your identity, your values.
Mm.
What could feel like home right now might not feel like home in a couple months' time. And it's something that I've felt like I'd had a really odd relationship with, especially when moving to different countries. Like I remember the last time I looked into the apartment I was living in Miami, and I remember thinking, this has been home for a while now. It's really odd to go to a different home, but at the same time, like, not to sound too like cliche or cheesy, like I genuinely feel like I'm home when I'm with my wife. Like our relationship has spanned half my life at this point, and it's there's this song lyric from a hardcore band I really like called Counterparts, which so many hardcore kids have tattooed on them, by the way, which is the line, "You're the difference between hell and home." And it's always hit really hard because I genuinely do believe that the people you surround yourself should be that, where
Mhm.
it matters less where you are, what the situation is, if you've got each other's back, basically, and like you've got those shared values. And it's interesting, and I think this is something that you get a lot more perspective on, again, from living in different places, where you start to realize that disconnect between national identity and personal identity.
This is so fascinating, and we could probably devote a whole other hour to this. Yeah, I'll just tell two sets of stories. So I was born in Hong Kong and then moved to the US to Cincinnati when I was 10 years old. So what's unique is I we sold a house in Cincinnati a couple years ago, and that was where I grew up during my formative years, right? My junior high years, my high school years, and even that was like where home was during college when we were shoved out of the dorms. Like, where did I go? Home, right? Cincinnati was home in that sense. However, so you know that piece of property was my physical home address for over 15 years, right? Maybe more actually. Yet when we sold the house, I had zero emotion. Like, it was like I didn't belong there. Like, I never felt belonging there. So it was like, it was just a commercial, real estate transaction. Like, it was like, okay, I went to the closing, signed my papers and then left and got got some lunch and then got on the plane. Like, that was that, right? Like anything else. And however, I remember taking Luke to Hong Kong with me, when we first met, and I took him to where I was born. Like, well, I was born in the hospital, but like where, right, I
Yeah.
was as a kid. Like, those were my first 10 years of life. And I was so overcome with emotion, just literally, like, I couldn't hold back the tears. And it was like, well, this is the source of like me as a being. Yet
Mm.
I haven't lived in Hong Kong full time since, right, early 90s. I don't vote there. I don't do anything there. But like that sense of like sort of my origin felt so strong, right? Yet again, like I haven't lived there full time for the majority of my life. Yet it just that, yeah, there's something about that return that was really powerful. And to take that into the corporate context, I totally agree with you. Like, in that, so two very drastic examples. So I was actually looking through my journal the other day because I remember writing something about not feeling at home or the lack of belonging in a role that I took on about 2 years ago. It was about 2 years and 2 months ago, and I found that entry, and the language was completely negative. It was like, I am so uneasy. I feel so out of sorts. I feel like I made a mistake. These people don't get me. I don't get them. I have to watch my, everything I say, everything I do is so exhausting. And that was like week one. Not even full 10 days at the new job. And I was like out of sorts, uneasy, just
Yeah.
really uncomfortable. And then I look back to another journal entry where it was a place where I had found my people with whom I share common values, right? That kind of same drive and commitment to excellence. And day and night, it was like the journal entry was like, I found my people. I'm so energized. I love this stuff. Man, where were these people before? Like, right, it's completely different. And so I think what we're both saying is some of these things are, again, very primal to us, right? Like, we just have that feeling of like, you either are at home or you're not. Yet I love the way we've unpacked it, right? To go, actually, it's not a linear determining process, right? It's not just because you're of this category, therefore you will feel here, right? Belonging here. It doesn't quite work that way. And I love that we've taken, the listeners through a journey of how that kind of emotional anchoring and connection really is multifaceted.
Yeah, I think, to I guess wrap it up with one point to connect it to your Hong Kong story. Like, even though, for example, I don't really foresee moving back to Iceland as an example, I still have a really strong connection to it as, like you said, that place of origin. And you know, it is the place where I spent my childhood. And like, if I ever have a kid, I definitely want to show them the place. I want to show them where I played as a kid. I want to
Mhm.
show them the nature. I want them to
Yeah,
experience it. I want them to speak the language. So
yeah.
it's it's definitely a part of me still. And I
Mhm.
think even though it's not fully like the home for me, it's still in one way or another a home.
Yeah.
And, you know, I guess what I'm saying in other words, home isn't one place, home isn't one state of mind. It can be so many different things. You can feel at home somewhere one day and the next not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's it's sort of like a meditative state that you get to in a way where, you know, you feel at home and it's something like you said, it's something primal and something you can't fake. So smooth segue. Speaking of faking, next week we want to do I for imitation. So, you know, is imitation the sincerest form of flattery, or is it just a really flaccid form of fakery? We'll dive into it next week from a lot of different angles, I'm sure. But until then, have a nice week and hope you enjoyed the show.